There is a continent the size of the United States and Mexico combined, and approximately 98% of it has never been seen by any civilian eye. That is not a conspiracy. That is simply a fact, and it is the most uncomfortable fact I have ever decided to sit with quietly. The question I keep returning to is not whether something is hidden there. The question is whether the mechanisms of concealment we have built around Antarctica are proportionate to the reasons we have been given for building them. Because when you look at those reasons carefully, they do not quite add up. The official explanation is elegant and, on its surface, entirely reasonable. Antarctica is a scientific preserve protected by the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, a remarkable agreement signed by 12 nations during the Cold War that designated the continent as a zone of peace reserved exclusively for scientific research. Military activity is prohibited. Territorial claims are frozen. No single nation owns it. The treaty has been celebrated for decades as one of the most successful international agreements in history, a rare moment of cooperation between adversaries, and most people accept this framing completely because there is no obvious reason not to. The science conducted there is real and important. Climate records locked in ice cores, atmospheric data, studies of cosmic radiation in one of the cleanest environments on Earth. Researchers from dozens of nations work side by side at stations like Mercator and Concordia. It looks, from the outside, entirely transparent. And then you look at Operation Highjump, and something shifts. In 1946, the United States Navy launched the largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and approximately 4,700 men under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. The stated purpose was scientific research, a peacetime science mission. Except that the Navy's own briefing documents described objectives that included establishing bases, testing military equipment in polar conditions, and training personnel for cold weather operations. That framing is difficult to reconcile with the word scientific. But that is not the part that keeps me sitting with this question. What keeps me sitting with it is what happened when Highjump ended, abruptly, months ahead of schedule, with 8 men dead, at least 1 aircraft destroyed under disputed circumstances, and Admiral Byrd giving press interviews in which he described the strategic importance of the polar region in terms that far exceeded the mission's stated scientific scope. The Navy has never fully explained the early return. The official reasons given across different sources do not agree with one another. Some documents cite weather, others cite fuel shortages, others offer nothing at all. For a mission of that scale and military precision, the silence around its conclusion is remarkable. Now, I want to be fair here, and I want you to hold the same standard I'm trying to hold. A single anomalous event proves nothing. Military operations end early for mundane reasons. Accounts differ. Press interviews from the 1940s are not always reliable. I know all of this. I have held it carefully. What I cannot hold as easily is what comes before Highjump, because the anomalies do not begin with Byrd. They begin, strangely, with a map. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer known simply as Piri Reis, is a documented historical artifact currently housed in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It has been examined by historians, cartographers, and military analysts for over a century. What makes it unusual is that its lower section appears to depict a large southern landmass with a level of geographic accuracy no European explorer had achieved in 1513, more than 300 years before Antarctica was officially confirmed to exist. The continent was not verified until 1820. Piri Reis noted in his own marginalia that he compiled the map from older source charts, some, he indicated, originating from ancient Alexandria. Those sources no longer exist. What does exist is a document whose lower margin corresponds, in ways that have not been cleanly dismissed, to the Antarctic coastline. The standard explanation is that this is a coincidence of projection and interpretation, that the landmass is South America distorted, or a speculative terra australis routinely added by mapmakers of that era as a theoretical counterbalance to the northern continents. This is a serious scholarly argument, and I want to give it its full weight before moving on. Captain Lorenzo W. Burroughs of the United States Air Force examined the Piri Reis map in 1960 as part of a formal cartographic analysis. He concluded that certain coastal features corresponded to Antarctica's subglacial topography, landforms confirmed only by modern seismic survey. He was not a fringe researcher. He was a serving military cartographer. His letter, Professor Charles Hapgood, who had formally raised these questions in published academic work, acknowledged the correspondence as remarkable. That letter has been reproduced in published scholarship. It has not been refuted, only ignored or quietly sidestepped. There is a meaningful difference between those two responses, and I think it matters which one is actually occurring. Now the pattern begins to accumulate, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because the accumulation is the argument. The Oronteus Finaeus map of 1531 depicts Antarctica again, this time with mountain ranges, river systems, and a recognizable coastline that matches modern subglacial surveys more closely than it resembles any speculative projection of that era. The Mercator map of 1569 does the same. These are not fringe documents. They are foundational cartographic artifacts studied in serious academic institutions. The consistent explanation that they are all independent products of the same terra australis tradition requires those mapmakers to have independently arrived at remarkably accurate geography through pure speculation alone. That explanation is possible. I want to say that clearly. It is possible. But the specificity of the correspondence, the river deltas, the interior mountain topology, the absence of ice along specific coastal sections goes beyond what speculative cartographic tradition typically produces, and it has never been explained in a way that fully closes the question. Consider also the German Antarctic expedition of 1938 and 1939, the Neuschwabenland expedition, a fact of documented history, not fringe speculation. The Third Reich sent a full scientific team to the continent, conducted extensive aerial surveys of what is now Queen Maud Land, and dropped hundreds of metal markers across the ice to formally assert territorial claim. Germany, a nation already mobilizing for continental war, chose to invest significant resources in the most remote and inhospitable landmass on Earth. The stated rationale was the study of whaling routes and meteorological patterns. That rationale has always struck serious historians as conspicuously thin for an expedition of that scale, at that particular moment in political history. This is where I want to pause, because I am aware of what the pattern I am describing implies, and I want to be careful about it. The implication is not that someone orchestrated a suppression campaign across 5 centuries. I do not believe that. The architecture of silence around Antarctica is not that intentional. What I think is more unsettling is that institutions, scientific, military, governmental, share structural incentives that produce coordinated silence without requiring actual coordination. When a discovery does not fit the established model, the path of least institutional resistance is simply to not pursue it further. That is not conspiracy, that is bureaucracy. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958 is the stated origin of the Antarctic Treaty, a global scientific initiative that brought Cold War adversaries into rare cooperation. What is less discussed is how rapidly, following that cooperation, permanent restricted access was formalized and how thoroughly the resulting treaty foreclosed on independent civilian investigation. The Antarctic Treaty itself, for all its genuine merit as a peace agreement, creates a legal architecture that makes independent verification nearly impossible for any private citizen or non-governmental researcher. You cannot simply fly to Antarctica and begin investigating. You cannot conduct unsanctioned aerial surveys. The continent is, by international law, off-limits to independent inquiry. I am not saying the treaty was designed for that purpose. I am saying that the effect is the same regardless of the intent. And when a structure that prevents independent verification also happens to exist precisely where the questions are most inconvenient, the logical tension is worth naming directly rather than leaving unexamined. Let me steelman the other side again, because it deserves it. The Antarctic Treaty was signed during genuine international tension, and its architects were working to prevent militarization of a strategically significant continent. The access restrictions are logistically motivated as much as anything else. Antarctic is genuinely lethally hostile to unequipped or unprepared visitors. The absence of civilian access does not require a hidden agenda. Oceans cover 70% of the Earth and are similarly inaccessible to most people. The deep ocean floor has been mapped less thoroughly than the surface of Mars. Nobody seriously argues this constitutes suppression. Inaccessibility is not by itself evidence of concealment. I accept all of that. And yet, Lake Vostok sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice in eastern Antarctica, one of the largest subglacial lakes on Earth, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, entirely sealed from the surface and isolated from outside contact for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. Russian scientists drilled into it in 2012. What they found has been published only partially. The Russian Antarctic expedition reported unusual bacterial life in recovered samples, organisms with no close genetic match to any life form in the known database, according to initial analyses published by researchers including Sergei Bulot of the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute. Subsequent official statements walked those findings back without fully explaining the revision. The scientific community largely accepted the new conclusion, but the initial finding did not disappear. It remains in published literature. Sample contamination in deep ice drilling is a genuine methodological risk, and I respect that. What I cannot equally dismiss is the speed and completeness of the institutional retreat. Return for a moment to Admiral Byrd, because the Highjump anomaly does not end with the early return. In 1947, Byrd delivered a classified briefing to the Joint Chiefs of Staff upon his return. The content of that briefing has never been fully declassified. Partial document releases exist. The core of what he reported remains sealed to this day. Byrd spoke publicly, on at least 2 occasions following Highjump, about the strategic significance of Antarctica in terms that went far beyond anything the scientific framing of his missions would require. In recorded statements before his final expedition in 1955, he described the region as potentially holding resources capable of reshaping world power, a phrase rarely quoted today in its full context. That is not by itself unusual for a military debriefing from 1947. Classified documents from that era are common, but Byrd was not merely a military officer. He was a celebrated national hero who had already completed 4 Antarctic expeditions, whose public profile made classification an unusual and especially visible institutional choice. Then there is Operation Deep Freeze, which replaced Highjump in 1955 and continues to this day, a permanent US military presence on a continent the Antarctic Treaty officially prohibits from military use. The official designation is logistical support for science. The hardware, the personnel structure, and the operational budget have consistently exceeded what pure logistics requires. The no-fly zones that exist over certain sectors of Antarctica have no parallel on any other continent. Some are actively enforced. Some are simply understood by aircraft operators without formal documentation. Satellite imaging available through commercial providers is, in specific and irregular areas, replaced with older or deliberately degraded imagery. Independent researchers using publicly available mapping tools have documented this. There is a region in Marie Byrd Land, named, incidentally, after Admiral Byrd's wife, where aerial survey data collected during deep freeze operations has never been published in full. Researchers who have filed formal information requests through established legal channels have received partial responses, heavily redacted documents, or no response at all. The gap is documented, not assumed. I want to address the hollow Earth theory directly, because it tends to swallow conversations like this one. The literal hypothesis, an inhabitable interior cavity beneath the crust, is not scientifically viable. Seismic data, gravitational measurements, and fundamental physics collectively rule it out in any form the classical theory describes. I am not defending that theory here, but something more credible lives inside it, once you strip the impossible architecture away. The theory persists, because it is a container for a more precise question, whether Antarctica conceals physical evidence of something that preceded modern human civilization, not a world inside the Earth, but structures or traces buried beneath it. The Antarctic ice sheet is not static. It has moved, accumulated, and shifted dramatically over geological time. The continent beneath is not a flat, frozen plain. It contains mountain ranges, river valleys, and liquid lakes. A civilization, if one existed during a warmer geological period in this region, could leave structural traces detectable beneath modern ice. The last time significant portions of Antarctica were ice-free was during the Pliocene epoch, roughly 3 million years ago, when hominid ancestors were walking upright in Africa. Not modern humans, not civilization as we define it. The standard geological timeline makes any recognizably human Antarctic civilization essentially impossible. I hold that seriously, and I do not set it aside. And yet the maps exist, and the maps depict not merely a coastline, but a structured, populated-looking geography, river systems, interior mountain features, subglacial topography, in a form that corresponds to the landscape confirmed by modern ice-penetrating radar. The cartographers who drew those maps did not have radar. They had sources. Where did those sources come from? There are geologists and glaciologists who have worked directly on the continent and have spoken privately about research findings that did not appear in the published literature from their expeditions. I will not ask you to trust anonymous accounts, but the pattern of what surfaces publicly and what does not is itself a data point worth holding carefully alongside everything else. I have spent a long time trying to find a clean exit from this question, and I have not found one. Every reasonable explanation I apply to one piece of the pattern creates a problem for another. The maps require ancient knowledge. The expeditions suggest concealment. The treaty creates inaccessibility. The anomalies persist across independent sources and independent centuries. What I am most reluctant to do, because it is the easiest and intellectually laziest option, is to connect all of these threads into a single coherent narrative and call it an answer. That would feel satisfying in the way premature answers always feel satisfying, right up until they collapse under the weight of the next question. So instead, I want to leave you with the shape of the problem rather than the outline of a solution. A continent the size of 2 major nations, locked behind international law, guarded by permanent military infrastructure, where the most unexpected findings consistently retreat into institutional silence. That shape has a name. The name is not coincidence. I don't know what is under the ice. I genuinely do not. But the absence of knowledge and the absence of access are not the same thing. What we have in Antarctica is both, arranged in a pattern that has received far less careful attention than it deserves. The ice does not explain the door.